Hi, welcome to the lecture on wine distribution and sales. I'm Paul Wagner, and I teach both at Napa Valley College and the Culinary Institute of America. And this presentation is a combination both of a little bit about sales. The following lecture will specifically talk about sales techniques, but this is really talking about how to put wine into distribution, what the channels are, what the appropriate channels are. We're going to talk a little bit about context, what's going on in the market, a little bit about the three-tier system, and then we'll really dive into wine distributors and ultimately the other channels of distribution, all of which should give you at the end a pretty clear idea of how you might want to approach this very complicated topic in the world of wine. So, in the world of wine, we do have a problem, which is that global wine consumption is not growing nearly as fast as production. And production continues to grow, even though 2021 was a miserable year in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, whether that be California or France or etc. But the Southern Hemisphere had a bumper crop. And in general, we have more wine than we drink. And that is not good news for people who make wine with the intention of selling it for a profit and making a living. So in general, while the wine business is considered a relatively cooperative, collegial industry, what you're going to see become even more extreme over the next few years is the fact that there's more and more wine targeted towards what is on a percentage basis, smaller and smaller market, and things are going to get tight, things are going to get tough, and the people who get smart are the ones who are going to survive. And this just gives you an idea. Admittedly, the data is a little outdated, but I love the chart because it shows you just exactly how important wine is in the world of what America drinks. You can see soft drinks, bottled water, coffee, milk. Beer is the first alcoholic beverage, and it's way the heck down on the chart. That tiny little rose-colored strip at the very bottom, just above spirits, is wine in relation to the rest of these beverages. You can see, it's not very impressive, is it? And the bad news is that spirits is growing much quicker than wine is these days. So in fact, there's every reason to expect in 10 years or so that wine is not going to be the second to the least popular beverage in America. It's going to be the least popular beverage in America. Nice work, everybody in the wine industry. And what that means is we've got to do a much better job. I have a million suggestions on how to do that, but we don't have time for those today. But I did want to point this out because I think it's pretty darn important. All of the wine in America is sold through a basic system that is 100 years old. It's the three-tier system. You need a separate license for each one of these. I assume that most of you will have some background on this, but just in case, I'm going to run through it very quickly. You need a separate license issued by the federal government to be a producer or importer of alcoholic beverages. You need a separate license on a state basis to distribute that beverage in an individual state, and then you need a separate license, often not only a state license, but sometimes subject to local jurisdiction, to open a restaurant or a retail shop. So in each case, you need a separate license. It is illegal to have more than one of those licenses. So if you're a producer, you can't be a distributor. If you're a distributor, you can't own a retail shop. All of this designed back 100 years ago to prevent organized crime, which dominated the alcoholic beverage industry during Prohibition, to move forward and continue to play a role in alcohol today. Admittedly, that's 100 years old. It worked effectively in those days. It's pretty much unnecessary now, but it's almost impossible to change. It exists because of Prohibition, and it doesn't work very efficiently. And we're going to talk in the next few slides exactly about why this system works so poorly in the United States. But before we get into the problems of distributors, although the one's right there is consolidation, one of the questions that I would suggest you really need to address in any business plan is what constitutes good distribution for your business model. For not every business model will have the same goals in terms of good distribution. One question would be if you are a very high-end winery that wants to sell everything direct to consumer, you may only want to be in 5 great restaurants across America, and really only to be able to say we're in the best restaurants in America, not because you want to sell them any wine. On the other hand, if you're making 1 million cases of Zinfandel, you probably need absolutely national distribution through major distribution companies. So where you fit on that spectrum will really determine what you define as good distribution. Some wineries will tell you, I only want to be in 4 states. I want to be in California, Texas, New York, and I always want to be in Louisiana because we have family in Louisiana. That's a legitimate goal for good distribution. What is not a good goal for distribution is to say we'd like to be anywhere that will take us, or we'd like to be national. We only make 800 cases, but we'd like to be in all of the 50 states. It's really unrealistic, really isn't a good plan. So before we get into how to deal with distributors, I need you to understand, before we start, you should have a plan in place before you start fighting for distributor attention. And the reason you have to fight for distributor attention is because of the massive consolidation amongst distributors. These days, there are 3 major wine distribution companies, and they control somewhere between 80 and 95% of all the wine in distribution in America today. So it's just a massive impact, and it makes many markets very non-competitive. And it makes it very difficult for wineries to get wine into that pipeline. Now, the pipeline is simply anything, any element of the wine industry that comes between when the winery puts the wine in the bottle and when a consumer pulls the cork out of that bottle in their home. Anything in the middle there, that's the pipeline. Could include distribution, shipping, retail shops, restaurants, etc. All of those things are the pipeline. And one of the biggest challenges right now today is that we have some major bottlenecks in that pipeline. For example, and notice the dates here because this has changed it has become even more extreme. In 1995 in America, there were 2,600 wineries and 3,000 distributors. Now, admittedly, the distributors are broken out between 50 states. So at 3,000 distributors, if they were evenly distributed, which they're not, but if they were, that would be 60 distributors in each state. Today, there are possibly 10 in each state, and that 600 is high. It's probably down to about 500 now. The wineries have increased. We're at 10,000 wineries. So in fact, what you're seeing is number of distributors shrinking, like the Wicked Witch of the West. And in the meantime, number of wineries growing exponentially, so that it's simply an untenable situation right now that big distributors have enormous leverage in the marketplace. Small wineries have almost no leverage in the marketplace. Which is to say that the first customer you have as a winery is not that person who buys your wine and puts it on his table. It's getting in the door of the distributor. And of course, distributors have a very different set of criteria than customers. Customers want a wine that tastes good and makes them feel good. Distributors want wines that resell quickly and easily. And I can't underscore that enough. What distributors want are wines they don't have to work to sell. They want wines that sell themselves. This doesn't mean that they want wines that taste so good that people will come back and buy another bottle, because they don't taste wines for their customers. What distributor wants is a wine that when they put it on the shelf, it sells all by itself without any work from anybody, and it sells quickly and at a good profit margin. And as a small winery with relatively few marketing dollars and no brand presence in the market, that's a very difficult criteria to meet. So yeah, do they want 95 points? Absolutely. They'd like 100 points. Distributors want 100-point wines. But there are a bunch of 100-point wines these days, and then they want the 95-point wines. Yeah, but with 95-point wines, you probably need to have some help. And 92-point wines, dear God, there are thousands of those. All of a sudden, 92 points doesn't mean much to a distributor. So give you an idea, that's a huge challenge for any small winery, is to come into a distributor and say, there's a reason you need to carry my product. Many of these distributors have 5,000, 10,000, up to 20,000 wines in their portfolio. So you've got a distributorship, 20,000 wines in the portfolio, and you come in with your unique selling proposition, which is, as Elizabeth Slater likes to say, we're a small family winery. We carefully select our vineyards. We handcraft our wines, and we've won some awards. And they say, I've got 19,900 wines like that in my book already. Why do I need yours? And you don't have an answer for that question. So this is a huge challenge in the world of wine today, especially because ultimately what you want in terms of a distributorship is not a sales outlet. You want a marriage. You want someone who will work with you, who will help your product when it needs help. You will help them to help your product. You want a relationship. And the problem is you're dealing with a man or woman who's already married 20,000 people. So becoming the 20,001st person in that marriage is going to be pretty complicated in terms of really making it work on a one-on-one basis. It's kind of an ugly image, isn't it? That sultan there with his harem of 20,000 brides. But that's the problem. You need to want each other. And in most cases, distributors don't want new products. I have presented really good products, 93, 94-point wines selling for $20 a bottle. And point blank, the distributor said, if I really wanted to sell more of this kind of wine, I've got wines like this in my portfolio. I need to do a better job of selling those wines rather than increasing my workload by adding a bunch more items to our portfolio. So big challenge, you need to want each other. There are, for importers, there are sort of three options if you're talking about bringing a wine in from out of the country. One of them is there are national importers who will then have relationships with a range of distributors across the country. So for example, Maison Marque & Domaine has relationships with distributors in every state. But that doesn't mean that every wine Maison Marque & Domaine carries is represented by each one of those distributors, because even with a company as big and powerful as Maison Marque & Domaine is, they talk to a distributor and the distributor just says, I don't have time, I don't have money, I don't have need for this product. I'm only taking these products from you. So even a big company has that challenge. Imagine what a small one does. There are regional importers who only specialize in certain parts of the country. And those may be an option for some companies. And what is becoming, I think, a potential for the future, there are what I consider to be fulfillment importers. There are also fulfillment distributors who basically pass the paperwork through, but do absolutely no work. So you have to get the order. You have to then tell the importer, I just got this order. You need to ship the wine to these guys, and chase the paper trail through. They only do this as a way of clearing products through the complicated three-tier system for you. And of course, they get a cut as part of their job of doing that. So it is an option if you're very small and absolutely need to be certain places. But again, the real question is, what's your business plan? What is your goal for this brand? Where do you want to be 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road? And with all of that in mind, then what do you want? What are you looking for in terms of a distributor or an importer, for example? And when it comes to distributors, of course, you've got to sell them on your product. So in fact, whereas customers, you get to taste them in your tasting room, they like the wine, they buy the wine. Distributors is a whole different ball game. And distributors are quite skeptical of many of the claims you'll make. One of the challenges you have is that you've got to distribute not just your wine, but you've got to distribute your story. So you've got to send out marketing materials. The only challenge is distributor salespeople aren't paid to distribute materials. So you send out bottleneckers talking about how wonderful your wine is, but the salesman doesn't have time to put them on the bottles. One of the reasons this slide mentions the salesman's trunk is that every distributor I've ever known, if you ask to look in the trunk of the salesman's car, it's full of this stuff, and it's stuff that they call it trunk mulch, and it never gets put on the bottle or put on the shelf. It just gets carried around in the trunk for a while, and every once in a while somebody decides to clean out their trunk, and that's where all of those hard-earned dollars spent on marketing go. So it's a huge challenge. As a small winery, you can't possibly hope to get an entire distributor sales team excited about your product. In my rule is 80% of your wine will be sold by 20% of the salespeople in the distributorship. So when you talk to distributors, the goal isn't to get them all excited. Some of them are going to be calling on very different accounts. Some of them are dealing with different kinds of products. You need to find the 2 or 3 people in that room who really have an appetite and an interest in your product and get them excited. As a small producer, that's about all you can hope for at a distributor level. And then we should talk about key accounts because, of course, where you sell your wine in every market is absolutely critical information. And this will help you determine where you spend your money. It will determine where you spend your time. It will give you a sense of which distributors are doing what you want. So if your key accounts in Chicago are all white tablecloth restaurants and high-end wine shops, that's great. In Ohio, it turns out that it's a big discount house. Well, one of those 2 distributors isn't doing their job correctly, and it's your job to get in there and fix it. So those are the sorts of things that a key account list can shed light on. And then finally, for a small winery, you can't possibly afford to be in every state. So you really have to pick a few places where you can be effective. As I say, it's always a good idea to sell the wine where you've got relatives, because you can not only write off Thanksgiving, your Thanksgiving trip as a business expense, but your relatives might even buy a few bottles at the local store, so you get some pull through. But those are, as a small winery, you've really got to be no shotgun approaches here. You've really got to be very rifle shot targeted and specifically aim at each step and each goal you want to do. You simply don't have the money or the product to make mistakes. So where should you go? Well, I like the idea of, if you already sell wine in a product, you should spend more time there, because in a market, if you can, by getting your presence in that area, you can increase your sales. The distributor will like that. The retailer will like it. So yeah, if you're selling wine in Chicago, go to Chicago and boost those sales. Always a good idea. Also, if you are not a new winery, look at where you might have been selling wine before and sales have dropped. That's an indication that somehow you've fallen off the radar a little bit. Time to get out there, spend some time in the market, and boost that awareness up to the point where your sales can recover. And then third element, go where you've never been. If in the past you shipped off a really lousy bunch of Sauvignon Blanc to the Southeast because you thought people wouldn't notice, maybe the Southeast isn't where you need to go to sell more wine. People still remember that. And maybe you should look at the Pacific Northwest as a better potential growth market. So you need to analyze this across the board, because the ultimate question is always, where can I do the most good with the least money and the least effort? You have to be cost effective when you're in a small, even in a big winery, you have to be cost effective. And that means you need to be able to show results for what you do. And in that case, thinking ahead, planning ahead, giving yourself real expectations is a much better plan than simply showing up in a bunch of markets and saying, gosh, I hope this works. Just a little note here to show you how wine sales have changed, and this has continued. This is through 2018, but this has continued for some time now, which is that people are buying less wine, but they're buying more expensive wine. So it's a good thing to keep in mind as you make your presentations, as you make your pricing decisions. Are you making a wine that can compete in today's market, or are you aiming at what would have been a competitive pricing back in 2016, which frankly is going to put you kind of out of competition with what's going on today? Okay, you've decided, you've got a distributor, you've identified them, and you now want to go out there and rock their world. And you want to tell them all about the soil and all about the climate and all about the grape varieties and all the rest of that. And I'm going to tell you that none of that makes any difference to a distributor. What you really need to talk about when you talk to a distributor is, I like to explain this in simple terms. Distributors don't buy your product. Distributors invest in your inventory. And unless they can sell that investment at a good profit, they will never invest again. So in fact, even though you may say, I got my money and I shipped them the wine, so it's their wine, and they may say, I can do anything I want with this wine because I own it, both of which are correct. The truth is that unless that wine that you have sold them sells through successfully, quickly, and at a good profit, they will not reorder. They may actually dump it on the market to damage your brand. And in fact, even though they own that product that they bought, it is your responsibility to make sure that it sells through in a way that makes them satisfied. That is critical to understanding how distributors work, and you have to communicate that when you talk to a distributor. Make sure that message comes across loud and clear, and do be very careful. It is a mistake to tell distributors, I'd like you to sell a pallet a month, because they may very well find a discount bent can store down in Clearwater that can sell a pallet of your wine a month, and whereas you thought you were selling 50 cases to 50 wine shops around the state of Florida, it turns out that some guy's down there selling it off at 25% discounts and selling it off in ways that you would never dream of, because you gave the distributor the wrong information. You need to be very clear. I want the wine going here. I want the wine going there. I'm going to help you make that happen, and I'm going to make it easy for you to achieve those sales. And if you don't, then in fact what you did was you gave a percentage of your inventory to a distributor. They paid you for it, and they can do anything they want with it, including destroy your brand. So you need to keep this relationship vibrant, collaborative, healthy, and you need to do what you can to make sure your wine ends up exactly where you want it, and as quickly and as profitably as the distributor wants it. So when you come in, talk about what makes you different. And boy, you'd better have a good answer for this, because remember, these distributors have 5,000, 10,000 wines. What makes you different? You make good wine, so do all 10,000 wines. You have a particular kind of soil, nobody cares about that stuff. You need to come in with something, and this is the most difficult challenge in wine marketing, no question about it. What is it that really makes you different? You also need to avoid fighting local battles in a global market. Your job is not to go in there and explain how your particular style of Zinfandel from Paso is a little different from the other guys, because what you'll discover when you go out in the rest of the world is that Paso isn't even a region recognized in many parts of the global market. And the examples of this, Lodi now has 8 sub-appellations, but most consumers don't know what Lodi is. Where do these wines end up? They all end up lumped together anyway. So forget the local stuff. Your competition isn't the winery down the road. Your competition is the global market, and you need to think that way. In terms of distinguishing yourself, one of the things I think you could do that would be helpful is to explain that you're going to do a better job of supporting them in the market than anybody else. That's important to a distributorship. Yeah, it doesn't have to do with the kind of oak you use or whether or the titratable acidity in your wine, but it does convince them in language they understand that your product is a better one to carry than somebody else's because you're going to do more about it. The goal ultimately is to convince them that together you will be successful. And if you can do that, then you've shown you understand them. We'll talk about in the sales presentation how critical it is to build this relationship of trust and respect between seller and customer. But it shows you understand them and that you can work together. So clear definition of what makes you different, and then clear understanding that what they really care about is, am I going to get stuck with this stuff or is it going to sell? Here are a series of questions that as a producer you should ask yourself before you sign with the distributor. And it's 2 pages worth. I'm just going to run through them quickly. Again, all of these PowerPoints that I'm using will be provided to you so that you can use these as background. You don't need to take notes on this today or photograph the screen or anything. But these are questions that wineries should ask, and they're a great outline on, gosh, before I call a distributor, I think I better run through this list and make sure I got it all covered. So am I willing to let a distributor autonomously represent my brand? Remember, once they pay for it, they own the wine. They can do anything they want. Am I willing and able to support the distributor? Time, money to help them generate sales, what we just talked about. Have I identified my brand and listed its key competitive advantages? What makes you so special? What makes you different? Do I have a marketing strategy? Do I have a complete range of wines? If the distributor calls up and says, gosh, your Sauvignon Blanc is selling gangbusters, do you have any Pinot Noir or anything else? That would be a good thing to be prepared for. And as a small winery, do I have a volume available to really meet the demand? You sign up with a distributor, you tell them you want to be in white tablecloth restaurants, they get you on the list of some great restaurants, and 3 months later they call back to say, we need more wine, and you say, oh, we're running out. Well, restaurants don't want to hear that. Distributors don't want to hear that. So you need to plan ahead. And the same with 7, and not just this vintage, but every vintage. And as we talked about previously, have I priced the wines appropriately? Are distributors really going to make money on these deals? Keep going here. Do I understand the tax implications? Do I have customers that are purchasing direct from the winery? These are called, you are allowed to be your own distributor within your own state in most cases. And so in this case, these are called house accounts. So you may, for example, in the Napa Valley, sell to 3 or 4 restaurants in the Napa Valley just because you have a relationship with them. So you may want to keep those outside of your regular distributor relationship because there's a convenience of having these people close. But a question you'd want to discuss with any distributor in the area. At the same time, in Napa Valley, this isn't an issue. In Napa Valley, there are shipping consolidation centers that can ship wine all over the world practically. But if you're located in a less highly trafficked area, let's say the Sierra foothills, am I clear on how if I sign with the distributor in Hawaii or in Iowa, am I clear on how I'm going to get the wine to that distributor? You need to work out the logistics of that. Obviously, packaging has to be up to standards. Am I clear what the sales goals are? It's not enough to say, gosh, I'd like you to sell my wine. You should have specific goals about what you want to achieve. It's always terrifying for wineries to do this. They're so afraid they won't meet their goals that they often refuse to set them. But if you don't set goals, you have no way of understanding whether or not you're ever going to make money. So set those goals. Task yourself with the idea we will achieve them. And signing with a distributor does not necessarily guarantee they're going to sell the wine, at least not the way I want it to. They may end up with some wine that they dump, or it simply won't sell and it sits in their warehouse for 5 years. Problem? Absolutely. And again, it's a partnership. Both sides have to work to generate sales. And if you think that hiring a distributor is how you're going to sell your wine, no, you are going to sell your wine yourself. The distributor is the company that will deliver your wine in the various markets around the United States after you have done most of the work of selling it. Okay, enough fun with distributors. Boy, is it hard work and it's complicated, but let's talk about another option, which is, at least in many markets, there is the option of a broker. Now, brokers are different from distributors in one simple way. Brokers do not own ever. They do not take possession of your product. So they write orders, they call on accounts, but then it is your responsibility to deliver the wine to the account, collect the money, and then pay the broker a commission. So a distributor buys your product, you ship the product, they pay you, and then what happens after that, to a certain extent, is up to the distributor. Broker, just the opposite. Broker does not ever pay you. The broker takes an order, communicates the order to you, you deliver directly to the account sends money to you, and then you pay commission to the broker. Many of the contracts for brokers read that if the account doesn't pay the bill, the broker doesn't get the commission. So obviously, brokers have a real incentive to sell a lot of wine, because the more wine they sell, the more money they make on commission. That's a good thing. They will tend, as will distributors, to always focus on the easiest wines and the easiest ways to sell the wines. The bigger they are, the less focus they have on your product. But I like to think of brokers a little bit as those old trappers in the West, where they would set up a string of traps and they'd check them every week. Brokers call on a string of accounts, and they kind of have their accounts. They have good relationships with those accounts, and they can generally, if you sign with a broker, those brokers can then slot your product into those same accounts. Obviously, the more wineries they represent, the more competition for those slots. So it's just like a distributor. The bigger they get, the harder you have to work to keep their attention. But if you're looking for someone who will make sure your wine is not only available in every supermarket in the country, in every Chinese and Mexican restaurant in the country, and in every white tablecloth restaurant in the country as well, brokers are not the solution. Brokers tend to focus on one kind of account, specialize in one kind of account. Fine wine shops and small retail shops. Maybe there are brokers who specifically focus on airlines or on major chains. So those are options, but don't look at a broker as being the solution for all questions, but rather a targeted way to enter a specific area. They don't invest in your brand. So if your brand suddenly suffers a massive decline, they've got other brands and they're not going to worry about it. Whereas a distributor may have some investment in the success of that brand. But in every case, just like distributors, they're ultimately paid to move boxes. And if you exert pressure on them to move more boxes, that pressure will immediately express itself in selling in places where you may not have liked your wine to be sold, but they're trying to meet your goals, so that's what they do. Brokers, a secondary option for getting into specifically markets within your own state, but also in other areas and also in specialized markets. Just thought that was a sort of an interesting thing to add in there, that when they asked independent retailers who they thought the big competition was with them, the retailers said that the big competition were chain retailers, by which we assume they mean Total Wine, for example, and Bevmo, and other local independent retailers. They don't mention grocery stores, whereas I think most consumers would think grocery stores are a major competition for wine shops because they sell a lot more wine. So interesting that the retailers didn't see that. nobody sees online sales as big competition. Okay, now let's talk about the small winery solution to these big problems of consolidation. Remember, three distribution companies in America control something between 80 and 95% of all the wine sold in America. So as a small winery, what is your option? Well, your option is, for most small wineries, selling direct to the consumer. And this means tasting rooms, it means wine clubs, and a few other things. Clearly, it has the highest profit ratio. Remember that when you sell to a distributorship, you're selling at 50% of the suggested retail price. Now, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that your cost of goods is 40% of the suggested retail price. So when you sell to distributors, you're only making that 10% between 40 and 50. When you're selling to a consumer, you're making from 40 to 100, so a 60% profit ratio, much higher profit there than you're seeing selling to distributors. For many, many wineries, and we'll see a chart in a few minutes that goes into this, for many wineries, their direct sales are a smaller portion of their volume, but a much larger portion of their revenue. So they don't sell as much direct, they sell through distribution as well, but the amount they sell direct, the profit margin is just sky high compared to the profit margin on distribution. Obviously, it's very limited. You only sell what you can sell at the winery, but at least you can control it. And if you talk about shipping, the critical element in winery direct sales is getting the right people in your tasting room and treating them right, and then doing the follow-up that you can continue to ship them wine club, etc. So it's building long-term relationships with your individual customers. So here's the chart I was talking about, and you'll notice there on the left, 34% wholesale and direct-to-consumer 59%. This is, of course, average winery means nothing, but let's say a small winery, 5,000 cases, 10,000 cases. The profit margin from that 34% wholesale is likely to be 10% of their total profit margin, and the DTC profit margin is likely to be 90% of their profit margin. I talked to a winery the other day that the actual ratios were flipped. They sold 30%, 25% DTC, and basically 70% through distribution. The DTC contribution to revenue was 60% of their total revenue. So even though it was a far smaller percentage of their total sales, it was a much bigger percentage of revenue than distribution. Of course, that's because the profit margins are so high. Now, out of that, you have to pay tasting room staff and expenses, so it's not free money. But for a small winery, the idea that the most profitable way is to sell directly at full retail price, pretty obvious, I think. And when you look at the chart on the right here, you'll see that between tasting room and wine club, that's 80% of their sales. The other stuff, you might even look at, events, etc. You almost look at those as marketing activities rather than really sales opportunities. And in fact, many small wineries will tell you the amount of wine they sell wholesale, they try to focus that on top exposure, so that really their wholesale sales are viewed as a marketing expense to get the name out into the public. And where they make their money is almost completely with their tasting room and their wine club. So absolutely focus on this. This is critical to any small winery's success. And as we build business models going forward, and when we start talking about wine sales, which is the next lecture that you'll see from me, absolutely critical that you understand how important having a good sales team in your tasting room is, because it absolutely affects everything you do going forward. Here you can see it's slowing down a bit, but part of that is just because the wine industry as a whole has been slowing down. Remember that sales are almost flat from 2019 going forward. The growth rate is slowing. There is still opportunity here, but what this means to you is that we continue to see more wineries and more brands. We continue to see more competition for these dollars. It means you have to be smarter, you have to be more aggressive, you have to be more polished, and you have to be more sophisticated in your marketing. That old idea of making good wine and it'll sell itself, you just simply have to throw that in the garbage. That is absolutely not true. And what you have to do is be very targeted, very direct, very aggressive, very sophisticated in your marketing. So let's talk about how you sell more wine in a tasting room. Now, tasting room cellar door is what they call it in Australia and South Africa, the rest of the world. So I use the terms interchangeably. That's why it's up here today. Remember that you're not really selling wine, you're selling a destination. You are marketing your region, not just a winery. So what does a destination mean? A destination means a place that people want to go, not a winery people want to visit, but a place people want to go. We'll see a survey here in a minute of what people really want when they go to wine country, and it will surprise you, for example, that learning about wine doesn't even appear on the list of responses. What they want to do is have fun with their family and friends. So how can you create the environment that draws these people to you? If you're not selling enough, you need to do a better job of marketing your destination. You need to make your region a destination, and you're seeing this now all over the country, from Texas Hill Country to the Finger Lakes in New York, to Willamette Valley. All of these are suddenly not just wine producing regions, but destinations. You're seeing resorts and golf clubs and all the other things come up because that's what people want when they go on vacation. And absolutely critical here is that a winery really needs to look at its tasting room as a profit center. Let's get rid of this idea that tasting rooms are somehow wine education facilities that let people fall in love with wine. Yeah, well, if people aren't buying wine, falling in love doesn't do any good. And one of my biggest complaints about all of this is that wineries often say, we're educating our consumers. And then I always say, yeah, have you ever given them an exam when they walk out the door? Because they're not remembering any of this stuff. If you've ever worked in a tasting room, you can literally ask people as they walk in the door, where have you been? That winery down the road. Yeah. What did you think of them? Nice. People were nice. Yeah. Do you remember anything? There's a big oak tree out front. Yeah. Did they remember anything about how your winemaker only uses indigenous yeast? Nope, because they didn't care and they didn't understand what it meant anyway. So all of the effort some wineries put into these so-called educational efforts, in fact, is massively unsuccessful. They do it badly, they measure it badly, and they convince themselves they're doing this successfully because it makes them feel good. But in the end, the wineries that are going to be successful are the ones who point to the bottom line and say, we're selling wine and we're selling a lot of it. So think of your tasting room as a sales and profit center, not as an education center. And of course, you do want it to build the brand. So that means people need to have a very positive experience, not just a good experience, but an experience that is better than the experience they have at your competition. I can't stress this enough. Customers compare you to your competition. So when you are creating a visitor experience, when you are creating a visitor center, what you need to be thinking of is, what are the other guys doing? How can I do it better? How can I be the one that when people go home at the end of the day say, wow, you know, the one that I really loved was that winery. You want to be that winery. Here's what Gallo says. People come to have fun. They don't come to learn about wine. They don't really come to find a good wine. They come to have fun with their family and friends. They visit 1 to 2 wineries a day. Now, those of us in the business say, oh, come on, you know, we're going to drive up the trail and we're going to stop at Dariouche and taste the Syrah, and then we're going to go up to Stag's Leap and get a bottle of the Cab, and then over to Pine Ridge, and then over to Bob Sinski and get the Pinot. That's not what most consumers do. Most consumers are on vacation. They leave the home late or they leave the hotel late. They walk into the winery at 10:30 or 11. Maybe they go on a tour. Maybe they do a tasting. By then it's lunchtime. They go out to a nice restaurant. They have a bottle of wine at the restaurant. They have a great lunch. Now it's 2:30. They're looking at their watch. They're thinking they got to get home. They're kind of buzzed. Maybe they'll stop in at one winery on the way home. That's the average customer. And so we need to do a better job of understanding that. They love the wineries. One thing that is true in this study shows everybody, when they're leaving a winery, you're asked, did you enjoy yourself? And everybody says, oh, it was wonderful. What's interesting is if you call them up 6 months later, they don't remember which wineries they visited. In fact, in many cases, if you talk to them an hour later, they don't remember which wineries they visited. They do remember wine, because if you went on their way into a winery, if you ask them how much wine do you drink, they say a bottle a week. Call them 6 months later, how much wine do you drink? And if they visited wine country, they're more into wine. They're now drinking 2 bottles a week. But if you ask them which wineries do you visit, they don't remember. And if you ask them, so which wineries do you buy, they don't mention the wineries they visited. So the problem is a visit to wine country for most consumers is a generic visit to a wine-themed amusement park. And the only real way you're going to break through that is if you can give them a spectacular experience, sell them a ton of wine, and send them home with bottles that they will see on the table for weeks afterward so they remember. And all of that says a little less talking about how interesting the winemaking procedures are, and a little more focus on how can we give these people a memorable experience. Right now, wineries sell relatively little wine through the internet, partly because they do a really bad job of it. When you go on any winery website to pull up the bottle of wine, they give you the technical sheet on the wine, which doesn't tell anybody anything that they want to know. But the other problem is that most wineries have websites and they don't market the website very successfully. So I always say a great website is like a great billboard. If you don't promote it, if you don't put it someplace where people can see it, you might as well put it in your basement. And the problem with most wineries is they spend a lot of money on the website and then they don't spend any money driving people to the website. So the only people who see it are the people who already know about it, which means their mom may buy more wine or may at least go to the website from time to time. But as a tool to grow their market, it's pretty darn ineffective. You need to change the way you think about websites and use them as a way to build the brand. And that means promoting the website, buying words on Google so that people get driven to it, and all of those traditional online marketing philosophies. The other thing is that most winery websites are absolutely interchangeable. You change the labels and the names, and there's the picture of the winemaker in the vineyard, and there's the picture of the winemaker in the cellar, and there's the guy who owns the winery walking through the vineyard with his dog. It's all the same stuff, and none of this has any real sense of differentiation. There's always a picture of the bottle of wine with the beautiful plate of food, but any winery, generic winery website, and we've all seen them, they all look identical. It is possible to do things differently. I would give you one website as an example. A dear friend of mine has a winery up in Oregon called Big Table Farm. And if you go to bigtablefarm.com, you will see when you land on their website that this is a very different kind of site. Sure, there are glamour pictures, but they almost don't talk about the wine initially. They really just talk about the fact that they live on a big farm. They have a big table that they invite people to eat around. And it's really a communication about their lifestyle. The wine is very definitely secondary to the sense of this wonderful, quite sustainably farmed farm up there. And by the way, the wine is all sold out. So obviously they're doing something right. But give your website personality. Don't make it look like every other winery website. Find a way to make it look quite different. And then The last couple, respond to your customers. You know, these days, people, Yelp says if you write to Yelp, write to a business through Yelp, they suggest a 24-hour response time. Heck, I want a 10-minute response time. If I'm a customer, the difference in response time is one of the ways I will choose between one business and another. When you get an email, the first thing you should say is, how quickly are my competitors answering this email? And how can I answer it quicker than that so that I get the business? And you need to have that approach to dealing with your customers. That's the way to succeed selling wine on the internet. And same thing with the media. Wine writers, wine journalists, influencers are always looking for interesting things to write about. If you put the same stuff up that everybody else puts up on your website, you're not helping. You're not helping. So instead, give the media some help. Give them some interesting story ideas. Give them a different way to look at a topic. Give them something they can use in their life rather than giving them what every other winery does. I think this is an interesting chart because it shows that online retail customers buy more expensive wines than wine shoppers in a store. And that's because most wine shoppers in a store are buying, frankly, for tonight. And they're looking at $10 to $20 a bottle, and that's what they're buying. But online customers are they're planning ahead. They're knowing they're looking for something special. Often they are looking for the best price on a wine that they know about. So their average purchase price is consistently higher than it is just in a retail shop. Interesting little fact. But of course, the volume of online retail customers is absolutely tiny compared to those walking into a shop or a supermarket. So when you think about your tasting room, this is the classic sales funnel. How many customers are in your market? Now, Napa Valley gets between 3.5 and 4 million visitors a year. If you're in Salt Lake City and trying to start wine country outside of Salt Lake City, your numbers are going to be a lot smaller. So you've got a smaller funnel to begin with. But then the real questions from here on down all have to do with, okay, within those potential customers, how many of them have heard of me? How many of them recognize my brand? How many of them have I touched in some way to give them a predisposition to buy my product? And then how many of them actually walk in the door so that they will hear the sales presentation? And finally, how many of them, after they've heard the sales presentation, buy the wine? Now, the critical thing is you should know the answer to each one of these four questions. You know how many customers you've got. That's the easy one. You can just add that up. And you should be able to estimate pretty clearly how many customers walked in the door. So already you've got one of the ratios very interesting. 100 people walk in the door and 37 of them bought wine. The hell happened to the other 63? Why aren't we selling them wine? What can we do to do a better job of selling the customers who walk in the door more wine? Good question, good analysis. Let's try some things and measure it a year from now and see if we've made some differences. But then the next one up is, okay, how many people have been contacted and then how many visited? So we ran an ad in a newspaper and it reached 100,000 people, but we only got 35 people walking in the winery because of that. Okay, that newspaper ad wasn't a good spending. So now you've got to go back and look at, okay, what else can we do to drive people into the tasting room? Either the advertisement wasn't good or it's not the right publication, but how we are driving people into our tasting room is not as successful as we would like. Let's make some changes and measure it in 6 months or measure it in a year. All of these things are part of a marketing plan, but they absolutely ultimately affect how much wine you're going to sell. So in each one of those stages, you need to have written out a plan. There are this many customers in the market. We want this percentage of them to know about us. Of the ones who know about us, we want this percentage of those to come in the door. And of the ones who come in the door, we want to sell them this much wine. You need to write that out in a document, measure it categorize it, and then go back in 3, 6, 9, 12 months and say, how are we doing? Are we achieving our goals? Where can we turn up the volume and increase our sales? So in the end, it's really a big question. In your winery, what do? Do you go for national distribution? Do you go to specific markets? Do you only go to direct sales? In any case, I'm absolutely a believer that you need to develop direct relationships with your customers. If you're a large company selling on a national distribution level, one of the things you need to know is you need to have a direct line of communication to the salespeople at the distributorship. You need to be able to get them information, and you need to have a relationship with them beyond just with the top management of the distributorship. If you're selling to a restaurant, you also want to have a direct relationship with the sommelier or the waiters on the wait staff in the restaurant, because your job ultimately is to build these relationships into a sales network that is independent of the actual pipeline. You need to have direct communication with every single point of that pipeline so that you can help solve any problems as it goes along. It's a huge amount of work, but I'm just going to tell you, making wine is the easy part. Selling wine is the hard part. And to me, the real challenge here is for every hour you spend in the vineyard, you need to spend an hour talking with customers. For every hour you spend in the barrel room or the filtration room or the bottling line, you need to have people talking to customers, because ultimately customers is what will drive your business. The most valuable thing you own, the most valuable asset you have as a winery is not the vineyard. It's not the winery. It's not the wine itself or the barrels or the equipment. It's your customers. And brands or wineries that have dedicated customers are worth vastly larger sums of money than wineries that don't. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In the last 5 years, Constellation has bought 2 wine brands for over $300 million. Neither one of those wine brands has a winery, has vineyards. The only thing they bought was the customer base. Now, those 2 brands are The Prisoner and Meiomi. And I challenge you to find any winery that has vineyards, a winery, all of the hardscape that a winery entails, that was as profitable as something like Meiomi or The Prisoner. And the answer is those 2 companies developed a relationship with their customers that was then valuable to somebody else. So whether you're a small winery or a big winery, the goal is not to sell wine. The goal is not to build the brand so much as it is to develop a relationship, a human connection with your customers. And if you can do that, you will be successful. I don't have a contact slide at the end of this lecture, but I do promise one at the end of the next lecture, which is about sales, the techniques of actually selling. But I will say here, and I'll reiterate it again at the end of that lecture, that I am delighted to talk to you. I would love to hear from you. I take great delight in talking to students who have heard my lectures, who want to argue with me. I love that. Who want to ask my opinion of a project or a plan or a paper they're writing. It's why I'm a teacher. I think you can see I love talking about this stuff. So don't be afraid. Check out the contact on the next lecture. Send me an email. Reach out to me. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm happy to share my opinions. And hopefully this new generation that's coming into the world of wine will be able to do a better job of taking wine out to the public than my generation did. And hopefully that tiny little pink strip that was at the bottom of the list of or the chart of beverages in America, that tiny little pink strip that was wine. Hopefully in your generation, we can move that up a couple of slots as people really recognize how wonderful wine is, how interesting it is, and frankly, how much fun it is. So thanks. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we will be in touch.